One of the most common questions that we like to ask ourselves today as rational thinking humans is, what is it that I should do? And this question doesn't really work in many ways. It's a question that modern life has trained us to ask almost automatically, whether confronted by something new and unfamiliar, but also something long-standing and unresolved, something that brings tension to our lives. And we ask it because we live inside what you could call an instrumental culture. By that I mean a culture that treats reality as something that's purely there to be used. Everything is framed in terms of what works, what produces results, what can be measured, what moves us forward. And this way of thinking comes from empiricism, the idea that knowledge is only valid if it can be observed, tested, repeated, and rigorously reapplied. In the outer world, it works incredibly powerfully. But somewhere along the way, we turned that same logic inward onto ourselves. We began to treat our inner life, our thoughts, emotions, dreams, and identity as if they should function the same way, as if consciousness itself should deliver these actionable inputs for us. So when we feel stuck, we don't ask what's happening. We ask, what should I do next? What should I do instead? And that question already assumes something that's just inherently false. Instrumental thinking assumes a simple chain of commands. You take an input, you apply a method, and as a result, you get an output. And that works beautifully in laboratories, factories, schools, many other places. But when you try and apply it to inner life, it actually starts to break down pretty fast. Think about how we approach our inner world, our emotions. They lead us to ask, what's causing this and how do I fix it? Our relationships trick the mind into deciphering, what's the pattern and how do I improve the situation? Our identity egoically demands of us, what's my purpose and how do I go about executing it? And our dreams, they proffer illogical questions like, what does all this mean and what should I do about it too? Everything becomes a problem to solve, or a signal to decode, or a mechanism that needs some form of connection or reconnection. An ambiguity, instead of being a necessary and meaningful intermediary liminal stage, it becomes completely intolerable. The psyche doesn't operate like an experiment, sadly. It doesn't produce repeatable outputs, it doesn't respond to control variables, and it definitely doesn't give us any kind of reliable, considered instruction. In fact, the more we try and demand clarity from it, the less it complies. It's stubborn like that. It withdraws, it retracts, and it refuses our questions, and what happens next leaves us completely perplexed. What we get instead are images. If you turn inward and ask for direction, for certainty, the psyche doesn't give you a plan, it gives you a dream, a mood, it gives you a sense of heaviness, or a recurring image that you see time and time again. A feeling as well that something is no longer clicking, and that's not a failure of us, or even of our psyche. It's a different type of intelligence, responding to what is essentially the wrong demand. So the psyche isn't interested in helping the ego move efficiently, however much we will it to, however much we demand it to. What it's interested in is reorganizing us around a deeper culture, and that center can't be approached in a direct, linear way. I talked about this in my last video, what Carl Jung called circumambulation. Instead of moving toward the higher self in a straight line, consciousness prefers to circle it, almost tentatively. And in this practice that metaphorically emulates the old spiritual traditions from ancient religions, we find ourselves drawing closer to God, to our higher selves, through these recurring conflicts, themes, and dreams that gradually need to be broken down over time through repetition, allowing us to step into our higher self. And this process is arduous, of course. It's a lifetime's work, and it often feels indirect or even regressive. From the outside, it can feel like stagnation. And for individuals, it can feel even worse, like a total erosion of the self, like an erosion of the soul. But with each passing cycle, we remove something from within. We remove a certainty, maybe, that had never been questioned or put under the scope, an identity that was clung on to for far too long, or perhaps something even more trivial. But this happens without force, and it happens not because we decide to abandon these things, but because there is a version of ourselves that can no longer survive what is emerging in its place. This is what the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard called imagination. He called it fantasy. He studied imagination, and he considered it as a force that reshapes how we inhabit reality. He said this: imagination does not form images, it deforms them. It liberates us from them and takes us away from the very first image. So here's what that looks like in real terms. Imagine a recurring dream that you've had over many years. The setting, of course, is highly familiar, the emotional tone is immediately recognisable, but each time the dream reoccurs, something is just slightly off. The house has maybe fewer rooms, the corridor is longer than we remember it being, a door that was once there is now disappeared altogether, maybe there's a figure who used to speak to you in your dreams, and now they remain silent as if on mute. On the surface, the similarities make this feel like repetition, but what's actually happening is a deformation. The dream isn't repeating that same image anymore. In fact, it's slowly dismantling the original one, reorganising it, and over time it becomes a completely different dream altogether, so it's no longer a recurring dream. That original image often corresponded anyway to a kind of egoic story we had about ourselves, who we thought we were, where we thought we were going, what we imagined for our life and stubbornly become attached to. And so each iteration of this recurring dream helps to loosen the grip of the narrative. And it doesn't do this forcibly by arguing with it. It does it by making the dream feel less and less coherent, less inhabitable. And that in itself is the process of Jung's circumambulation at play. The American psychologist James Hillman, he took it one step further. He says, the dream is not a problem to be solved, but a place that is actually there to be entered. Now, that line only sounds a little bit vague if we don't take it seriously. Problems do demand solutions. They are there to be resolved. That is their purpose. Places don't have this because they don't have a purpose. If you enter a forest, for example, you don't extract meaning from the forest. It's not a riddle. You can't decode it, and instead you're expected to just let it orient you slowly. And we know the benefits of doing this. The circulatory benefits, regulatory system, nervous system, the body adjusts when we're in nature. With this, our attention shifts. And dreams work in a very similar way. They don't give us an instruction or a command. They establish a set of conditions in which we can live and react. They show us that the psychic terrain that we're currently moving through is there to be navigated, and orientation comes with clarity. This is where dreams can be considered alongside the sublime. Think of something simple, like navigating a new city on GPS or Apple Maps. You're going through street by street, turn by turn, and then suddenly you step up onto a hill and you see the entire layout of the city unfold beneath you. And all of a sudden, you no longer need direction. Your perspective and orientation has changed automatically because the scale of your landscape has changed. So landscapes rearrange themselves naturally all the time, in real life, in the sublime, as they are in dreams. And what mattered 5 minutes ago when we had one perspective is now completely irrelevant. These roots that were hidden at first are now becoming increasingly obvious. That's what the sublime does. The 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke wrote extensively on this subject, and his work is perhaps best encapsulated by his most famous quote, which is this: "The passion caused by the great and the sublime in nature is the feeling of astonishment, and astonishment is that state of the soul in which all other motions are suspended." Now, when motion is suspended, instrumental thinking, narrow thinking, tunnel vision, it stopped dead in its tracks. Astonishment is the interruption as well of the ego, and it does this through the sheer dominance and scale. You're dwarfed into insignificance, particularly by nature, by towering mountains, the endless ocean, dark, dark night, deep and empty silence. All of the intense, overwhelming natural phenomena that make us feel small and unimportant. That's what gives it significance. These events, this natural phenomena, it resizes our perspective of the landscape and helps us to see differently. And dreams do the very same thing in a much more inward way. They change the scale at which our life is being viewed. And when the scale changes, orientation changes as well. Modern life, by contrast, actively prevents this process from unfolding. It's constant stimulation that keeps this process at bay. Consciousness is locked down, we're always zoomed in, we're thinking tactically, always reacting or overreacting to what's happening around us. And with this intensity of the environment, there's just no space for deformation. There's no room for the sublime. There's no tolerance for uncertainty. And when dreams arrive and they intensify and their meanings loosen because we want certainty, that can feel threatening. That's why people call them nightmares sometimes. But it's not because we're actually under a real threat. It's because we've lost the conditions that allow symbolic intelligence to do its work naturally. And so in this way, dreams and the sublime are very, very similar. They don't tell you where to go, they don't give you instruction or direction. They change your landscape, the landscape that you're standing in. And once that map has been changed, some of the patterns, the preconditions we assume to be there, they simply vanish, disappear altogether. So the psyche doesn't refuse to give instruction because it's broken. It refuses because instruction would only interfere with your natural intelligence. And in a culture that's addicted to certainty, speed, progress and control, that refusal, it may be the last remaining act of intelligence that there truly is.